I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. Now, obviously, during this very difficult time, we are seeing some really fantastic examples of businesses going above and beyond. But unfortunately, there has been a rise in certain individuals undertaking unscrupulous practices. And we are seeing a rise in fraudulent activities, which are affecting businesses across the region. But what does this mean specifically for firms across the region, and what are the steps that they can put in place to overcome these issues? Well, today I'm delighted to be joined by Tim Merritt, partner at RSM, who will talk more in detail about this particular topic and the steps that firms can take to alleviate some of these issues. In terms of today's webinar, I'll start off by sharing some information on our Keep Business Moving campaign, which I'm sure a number of you are familiar with. I'll then hand over to Tim, who will run through his slides, and that should take us to around 11:30. And then we should have around 15 minutes for a Q&A session. Now, as you can see in the chat box, if you'd like to ask a question at any point, do write it in the chat box, and I'll ask it on your behalf during the Q&A. Also, if you encounter any technical difficulties, please consult the Click Meeting troubleshooting Q&A in the first instance. And I think my colleague Grace has put a message in the chat box as well, in terms of what you can be doing to ensure that we don't have any difficulties on that front. So very quickly then, for those of you who are not familiar with it, so we are running our Keep Business Moving campaign at the minute, and essentially it very much reflects the raison d'etre of the Chamber. So what we're trying to do is help businesses connect, support and grow during this very difficult time period. In terms of connecting, we're running our hashtag GB Chamber chat every weekday between 11 AM and 12 PM on Twitter. We're still running our member-to-member offers as well, so please do check those out. In terms of support, we have our COVID-19 hub, which has a raft of information on where businesses can access support. We're running a number of informative webinars, such as this one as well. And we still have our free legal and HR helpline, where members can access their service via their relationship manager. A big bulk of our work, of course, focused on lobbying and campaigning activity. So again, if you have case studies you'd like us to share with local and national stakeholders, please do let us know. And we are, of course, supporting government appeals, particularly for sourcing ventilators, hand sanitizer, and protective clothing for local hospitals. So again, in terms of the grow element, we are growing awareness of your business through our thought leadership content. So, for example, providing blog posts and videos on how firms are responding to the current crisis. And of course, we're still running our daily articles as well. So showcasing your business's latest news and initiatives, responding to the coronavirus crisis. And obviously that goes out to over 14,000 subscribers. But if you'd like any more information, do look at the website link there, which is www.greaterbirminghamchambers.com/coronavirus. Now, I mentioned some of the webinars that we're running, and you can see in front of you some of the other webinars which are coming up next week and this week. So we've got webinars which focus on maximizing short-term cash flow, managing team dynamics. There's one next week on putting a will in place during coronavirus. And there's also one on is your business digitally fit? So if you'd like any more information about those events, please do go to the Greater Birmingham Chambers website, and you can view the event section there. Now, just before I hand over to Tim, Tim's asked us to actually share a couple of questions with the audience today that we can then discuss the results and then go into the main bulk of the presentation itself. So I'm just going to ask my colleague Grace if she can put those questions up for the audience members to see, and then we can spend a minute or so just running through the answers to those. Okay, so the first question we have here: have you or your organization shared any material to heighten staff awareness excuse me, of the risks of fraud related to COVID-19? Yes or no? So if you click on the screen, you should be able to fill that in, and we should be able to see the results. Yes, you can hover just over the yes or no function there. Okay, I think we should be able to move on now, Grace. There you go. 63% saying yes, they have. And in terms of the next question, Grace, if we could just move on to that. Second question, have you or your organization experienced any fraud or attempted fraud related to COVID-19? Yes or no? Okay, I think we should be able to move on with that one now, Grace. 50%. Oh, okay. Worrying. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So what I'll do now then, I will now hand over to Tim, who will run through his slides, and we'll take it from there. And as I said, if you've got any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box. We'll collate them after Tim finishes his session, then we'll run through them for the last 15 minutes or so of the webinar.
Thank you, Raj. Just as my slides load, it'd be interesting to see of those who answered yes to that question to perhaps drop in the chat box what those frauds might have been, just to get a feel for the detail. But if you do that, and we'll pick it up a bit later. So just as Grace is loading my slides, I just wanted to just a tiny quick background to RSM, just put a bit of context about who we are. Apologies if you have heard of RSM. We're a large business advisory firm. We do have a significant presence in the Birmingham, West Midlands area. We've got an office in Temple Row. But I think more pertinent to today's session is I manage a team of fraud experts who have really two key roles across our client base. The first is to undertake investigations. Now, those cover both internal organizational investigations, but also criminals to standards. So we do, unfortunately, have cases that we take to court, which is sometimes quite interesting, but obviously quite sad that we have to do it. But the second point, which is probably more relevant for today's conversation, is the work we do to prevent fraud. I think it's often a missed opportunity for organizations not to concentrate in this area, looking more to deal with the effects of it. But a lot of work we do is on the awareness side, the training, the control enhancement, through to actually going looking in fraud identification. So that's all quite useful in the conversation we're going to have today. So just picking up, why does fraud happen, I suppose? I think even before we got into today's circumstance with COVID-19, we've seen an ongoing increase in fraud numbers across the piece. And I think the Credit Industry Fraud Advisory Service figures for the year end in 2018 identified over 300,000 instances of reported fraud. If I'm to be fair, a lot of that is card fraud, identity fraud, but just like the comment on the right-hand side, a large portion are cyber-related, which I'll talk about a bit more. But I think one of the things that we try to do in terms of looking at fraud is, why does fraud occur? What are the opportunities, the steps that cause somebody to enter the fraud arena? I think we look at it as a triangle. There's three potentials here. The one is pressure. I think personal debt, lifestyle requirements, gambling habits, that's often a driver for why people get involved with fraud. Second one is opportunity. People just see an opportunity or a circumstance or a method that they can undertake fraud, and they run with it as a professional role. And the third one is they see it as they have an ability to rationalize the fraud from a personal gain. My need is more than yours. You've got insurance, you'll cover it. So those are some of the thought processes that go behind why people can conduct fraud. And I think we can safely say that all three of those exist in the current circumstance. You just think about period of change, period of need, they're all heightened at the moment. Added to that, it's pretty clear that that awful term professional fraudsters have seen an opportunity here. I think they will always see an opportunity and run with it. And the COVID-19 scenario is no different. I think the first fraud was reported back in February around this, and so it didn't take them long to see an opportunity. I think where we've seen the biggest immediate increase in fraud attempts is around in the cyber arena. It is basically focused at the moment on phishing scams, again, but also we've seen a lot of cyber attacks on large organizations. Those that we saw before, perhaps there's a view that there's organizations that are more exposed at the moment. I think you may have read on the BBC and the national media that up until about a week or so ago, there have been 1.7 mil of reported fraud. I have the view that fraud is very much an iceberg scenario. We know what we know, which is on top. There's so much beneath that just doesn't get reported through embarrassment or actually unaware, that actually I suggest that figure is a lot higher. Most of the scams we've come across, as I see on the screen there, have been high volume. And what I mean by high volume, there's multiple attempts at it. They have low incidence of success, but when they do make money. Some of the ones we've seen are around donation requests, investments, false suppliers. I suppose it's important to know that none of these are new. These happen all the time. But I think where there's a greater level of concern over people working at home, etc. So I think the exposure we face is greater, which is, again, I'll touch it on a bit later in terms of the necessity over some improving IT controls, patching, etc. To all of this, it really is important that we remind our staff and ourselves that the basics haven't changed around making sure that we only click on those attachments that we recognize, that we consider the language that are in those emails. I've seen lots of emails where the logic and there's a theme to the emails which support the business need, but the tone isn't quite right, the reference, the hi, whatever. So it's just, when you read that email, does it feel like the normal correspondent you have with that individual? Look at the email address. The email addresses are very good in terms of often looking like they are authentic, but sometimes there's just a small change, a 0 instead of an O, or the other way around. So just be cautious on that. Obviously, there's always that view that if it feels too good to be true, it is. So it isn't so. So be careful on those. But the final message I will put to all, and it's a theme to all of this presentation, is never bypass accepted controls because of circumstance. I think controls are there for a purpose. And if you ever get an additional expectation to an email, ask yourself why, and don't just do it because it's come from the boss or a really important supplier. Go through your normal controls that you would expect to have in place. Looking beyond cyber, and I think, to be honest, cyber is the big issue at the moment, but some of these other areas that I'm going to cover now will come through and perhaps will be noticed a bit further down the line. I wanted to touch with those issues around suppliers and cash flow. I think there's a good chance that with the supply chain issues that we may be facing, that there is a necessity to broaden our supply base. And I appreciate the need for that. And I appreciate the need for maintaining the timing and the importance of servicing your clients. But again, it's really important that you don't relax your due diligence checks on those new suppliers. So whether or not it's maintaining financial background checks, making sure you fully understand their background, checking the organization's history, take references, do you know who they're working with, through to ensuring the quality of the goods is as said. I think they are all good checks that you would do in a normal place. Now, you may need to speed them up. There's no reason to drop those as a precaution against fraud. The other one bit that I will also raise that is just check about conflicts of interest. If you have one of your team coming to you with a new supplier that they know, just check that there's not a conflict there. That's something that we do see again around the procurement environment. The one thing that we have seen a number of organisations doing in this new world is to put some form of contractual provision for retrospective challenge of orders, deliveries, invoices, so that we're still working with our suppliers to make sure they get the money in time, goods are delivered, but just in case there's a problem down the line, you have a contractual fallback. The other issue we're seeing is around cash flow, and I think this is organisations and cash flow is a fundamental. We are seeing some pressure put on by suppliers to organisations to rush through payments. Now, I understand that the reason for that, but I still think organisations shouldn't lose that principle of paying on delivery and paying on delivery of quality goods as intended. You may still get a time lag from delivery to when your normal systems will pay. You may want to think about how you can improve that. And we've seen some instances of inclusion of credit card payments for some of the smaller sums. But I think it's just to make sure that you manage those clients' expectations whilst maintaining your control environment. The other aspect we can see of that is that sort of whole nature of being asked to make rapid payments does open the potential for mandate fraud. Now, those of you who have heard of mandate fraud, it's effectively when you have as I said earlier, an email or contact from a fraudster who impersonating a supplier, and they are asking for you to change bank details to make payments quickly. Sometimes I look at that and I feel, well, how do people fall for that trick? But it's quite prevalent. I've seen nearly 7-figure frauds being payments coming under that mandate fraud. So I think it's important that you maintain your control environment. If you get that email from a supplier, which is a bit abnormal, perhaps to change a bank account details, just give them a call, just check that actually those supplier details that may have changed are valid. You may also, in terms of the invoice area, you just may want to keep an eye on duplicate payments. So if you get perhaps 2 invoices through, maybe accidental, but it is a potential through the nature of what we're facing at the moment. But also make sure you check for false invoices, inflated invoices, just to make sure that your controls, and I think one of the things that we're seeing is actually a lot of homeworking of the people who do those tests to make sure that they're maintaining that responsibility, those controls that you would expect to see in place. Probably this next slide is probably a bit more relevant to those of you who work in supplying goods and services that are at high demand at the moment. There is a potential for the requirement for prompt movement of supplies and orders, that increase in stock control, asset control, maybe a bit more lax than it used to be. Once that demand for your goods increases, actually so does their attractivity to be stolen, to be, shall we say, reallocated. So it's again just reiterating to your team and your staff to manage stock, to make sure you, again, thinking about the distancing of staff, that your physical presence is maintained around stock, that you maintain decent audit trails, but also you use your own experience of unusual transactions and stock movement on a day-to-day basis. With regard to one of the things that I suppose I'm certainly, and most of my team are doing, is having to work from home. We've seen a necessity to support them staff in terms of the IT kit they've needed. So one of the checks and challenges I'll ask you is how robust are your staff's IT infrastructure, your organisation's IT infrastructure to support it whilst staff are working at home? Are they working on secure Wi-Fi? If they're using their own devices, how robust are those in terms of the systems, the virus protector, the firewalls? Also, confidential data, if it's on people's laptop, is it encrypted? But also, is it secure? Not only from secure through hacking and the like, but actually physically secure. I've seen a number of cases of burglaries increasing. So again, making sure that the laptops are encrypted and the like. Finally, which is probably something a tiny bit more difficult to deal with because it relies on the trust of our staff, is are they actually delivering on the work that you think they're delivering on? Now, are they achieving their tasks? Are they working to your expectations? We have seen instances where where individuals have used the self-isolation rule, go off sick, and then have appeared working elsewhere. Difficult to identify, difficult to actually prevent, but it's just something you just perhaps should be aware of in terms of keeping in touch with your staff. And one of the things that we've tried to do is to regularly communicate to your staff, support them, talk to them, so that actually, one, we should be doing that as an employer anyhow, but also to make sure that they're fulfilling their responsibility. just as a conclusion, I suppose overall through this process, whilst it's unprecedented times, there are different peaks, different challenges we face. My message ultimately is, if you're asked to bypass a control that you would normally have in place, really ask yourself why before you do it. And I think there is no problem with saying no to a client, because if there's a problem with that, they'll come back with you with an explanation. So be careful. Don't reduce your level of control. But unfortunately, there are fraudsters out there. And if you do encompass a fraud, they talk to your bank quickly to prevent payment, but also refer it to action fraud. That's all from me. I'm happy to take any questions on my presentation or anything else you may have seen.
Tim, thanks so much for that. That's fantastic. We've had a couple of points and questions that have been included. So I think Louise Hewitt has said, we've had a rise in phishing scams, attachments from cloned, compromised emails from known contacts pretending to be notices relating to their COVID-19 policies. And we've also had Erin Sims, who said, we've seen an increase in email scams relating to C19. Additionally, we've seen an increase on the same within our client base, as well as invoice mandate payment diversion attempts. I mean, this point on payment diversion attempts, do you want to quickly touch upon that?
Yeah, so the concern is that, so a couple of examples where we've seen it before. We've seen individuals where actually clients' systems have been hacked themselves. So when they get hacked, they can quickly identify through emails, invoices that have been sent out. So where in some of them is actually those invoices have been replicated, sent to our clients, and with a change of bank detail. So the invoices look excellent, the number, everything sort of flows through, the work's been done. And then we get a request, well, we need this payment really quickly. Can you push it through? And unless your controls are secure around not changing your supplier details, that payment goes to that email address, that changed bank address. And once it's in a fraudster's account, it's moved really quickly, and it's really hard to come back. So it's all around about checking those invoices you get through, back as I said earlier, in terms of look at the email address you received them from, but then go to, if the client's asking for something different to the normal process, don't just do it. Ask them why. Now I wouldn't know. We've seen examples where people have just responded to the email you received. That's just communicating with the fraudster. It's around giving your client a call, make sure that they know, and so that they can confirm, yes, I've asked for that change. And it is just staying on your guard in terms of why has something changed, rather than what it was perhaps the last time we paid an invoice.
Thanks for that, Tim. So we had a question from Rachel. What are your thoughts regarding the changes introduced by government and their anti-fraud measures?
So it's an interesting question. There's two thoughts at the moment. The one big area, I think, is the whole furlough scheme. Now, it's really going to be more of a fraud against the government rather than companies, organisations. But I think it is important that the businesses, they follow the guidance to get ready for those audits, because those audits will come down the line. The HMRC will undertake checks and challenges to those furlough claims. I think the wider issue about the government's approach to fraud at the moment is a tiny bit concerning. There was a message put out at the start of April by the government where it said actually the police, the prosecution authority should actually put fraud on the back burner. They didn't want to clog up the courts by including fraud cases to go to the judiciary system. That's a bit of a worry to me, because I won't say it opens a green light for people to undertake it, but actually it takes it off the agenda in terms of what's important at the moment. So I think it is a slight concern that the government have given that message out. I suppose finally on that one, my view is we're dealing with a lot of these email scams at the moment, that we can prevent those, we can identify those, we can report those to action fraud. When we hopefully get through this and we start looking at those payments we've made, have those payments been supported by goods received, have those staff we've paid for extra work we've recruited, should they have been recruited? Can they have been recruited? Did that work get undertaken? I don't think we're at the right time to do some of that work now, but I think we'll get back to a slightly more position of normality. Some of those frauds will come out, and I think organisations will need to follow those through.
So just on that then, as you mentioned in your presentation, is the key really about maintaining a good audit trail?
I think it's around making sure, it's probably about three things. It's making sure your control environment is robust, that the controls that you were operating before we got into this circumstance were sufficient, and if you choose to deviate from those, you make your checks and you make that conscious decision of why you're doing that. I think the second one is make sure your staff are aware of their responsibilities. Make sure they're out there. It's certainly on the theme through this is the email. Make sure those awareness of what they should do, what they shouldn't do, is constantly reminded to them. And the third one, if you make those decisions, just record it. I think we've got a question on there about idea. Come back to that in a second. But I think those checks and challenges are what I would expect a good business to do. I appreciate timing and staff availability may be pressured at this point, but my view is that's just good management to keep those three areas in mind.
Yeah, so you mentioned that we've got another question from Rachel here, which says, what should employers do regarding ID and right to work checks if they find themselves recruiting new staff?
So this question is based on this whole government line around evidencing your staff have a right to work in this country with the potential fines, or if you can't evidence that going forward. Now, obviously, there's a question mark on whether or not those people who recruit in this period will still potentially, and those organisations will face those fines. Time will tell on that one. But I think the government's given out some guidance to relax some of those controls. So some of those controls you would expect to see in terms of evidencing ID documentation in face-to-face and comparing them with the individual, that might not be possible now with social distancing. So the government's saying you can do that by providing a photo or scanned copy of your ID and then having a conference call like this to evidence it, to see if there is a relevance, and then obviously for the organisation to record when that happens. So that's a control that's accepted for now, but with the caveat that as soon as we get to a situation where social distancing is relaxed, you formalise those arrangements and you have those face-to-face meetings. And obviously, hopefully, that thought of actually providing that evidence is a deterrent. So I think the government's relaxed controls at the moment, but it will expect those to be picked up at the other end.
Now, that's a really interesting point, because throughout the webinars that we've been holding, one of the points that's come up quite often is which of the elements which are being put in place now do you see becoming part of the everyday norm beyond this crisis? So do you think there are practices that firms are putting in place right now which you think will actually be in place long term?
So the one for me is the instance of working from home. Mm-hmm. I think now I don't mind working from home as a matter of course, but actually I think now we've got a situation where most of my staff are working at home. There will be a move to that, I think, as the new norm. Within that is actually some of these controls that we expect to see people put in place around their IT kit through to delivery of work. I think that may well end up being a lot more, as you say, the new norm. I think some of the other issues I mentioned, I think controls are controls. So if you're evidencing payments, you still need good receipts. You still need evidence of changes to supply details, an example. The one about the ID checks, I don't think that one will change. I think there's unfortunately a bigger political issue around that, around only employing people who have the right to work in this country. And no judgment on right or wrong with that, but I just think that's probably a current status of where we are.
Okay, thank you for that. I guess obviously, one question I had actually, have you seen any regional disparities in terms of the types of activities that are happening or malicious intent of what's going on out there right now?
No, not really. I think from my experience, because most of these are email scenarios, that I think emails are high incidence. There's just chuck out to so many. There isn't a geographical nature of those. So I think not at the moment. I think perhaps all I will say is certain parts of the country, as the virus has spreaded, have had capacity to deal with those at a different time. So got hit quite quickly, and we've had trouble interacting with some of our clients, rightly so, because they're dealing with the here and now. Whilst other parts of the country who haven't quite had that there is a bit more interaction with. So I think it's more around the client's response rather than the fraud itself.
Okay. We have a question here from Louise. What's been the most surprising / unusual scam you've come across during COVID-19?
So I think I think I'm never surprised in what we see, because everyone will try anything. The ones I just shake my head at are the text messages which say, click on this link and the government will give you 250 quid. One, I think it's because it's just a classic example of a chance to try on people's insecurities. So that's the bit that sort of I just don't think anything is unusual. They're just rehashes of what we've seen. I suppose my point is how quickly organisations, professional fraudsters, turn the focus of a well-respected fraud from their point of view into the current circumstance. Now, the classic one here is the PPE issue. Now, we've seen examples of clients making purchases to fake companies trying to buy PPEs. I think that was also on the TV. And you just think, well, one, it's actually been done quite professionally, but two, it's just shocking how people take the opportunity as soon as they see it. But earlier in my slides, I've given up trying to rationalise why people do fraud, because they just see the opportunity or they need to do it. But it's not really anything specific, Louise. It's just nuances on historic fraud that we see.
And I was going to say, in relation to that, then, have you seen any examples of this happening overseas? I think I read about the Italian banking phishing scam. And are you concerned that some of those elements might actually translate to the UK? Or
so I have to be frank, Mike, I don't look too far off into other countries, but what we see is actually most of these are international. The ones around the fake PPE website are. So I'm not keen on just pulling out one country, because they're great and they're across the board. But the TV showed them from West Africa, and I just think that those are multinational. I don't think the GB has just been highlighted upon. I think it's generally these same frauds, happen across the piece.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, if you are a victim of fraud, so say if you've been scammed, then what are the practical steps that you need to take? Is it you need to get in touch with Action Fraud straight away?
So the number one is, if you've lost money, you have to contact your bank immediately. If you leave at any time, the likelihood of recovery is minimal. As I said earlier, the fraudsters move the money very quickly. So that's number one. The second one is contact Action Fraud. Now, the reality is Action Fraud will be so you'll record it, you'll get a number, it'll feed into national intelligence. Whether or not they'll support you in a short term, I'm not convinced. I will take the opportunity to. There are organisations such as RSM who can support you. Now, I think the one challenge I have here is that often when we see frauds, sometimes that fraud's occurred. You've got to stop it happening again. So whether or not it's getting ourselves in or other organisations to actually look at your systems, look at the robustness of your IT kit, or whichever, to actually make sure your future potential for the liability of those frauds to reoccur is actually diminished. So report to the bank, definitely report to Action Fraud, but then potentially include a third-party supplier who can come and help you and see, is there anything else out there? No, if it's an IT one, we've seen instances where organisations actually do malware get into your systems. So do you know that you cleared that out? So just think about that use of that third party to come and support you.
And with that then, I mean, with the third party support then, I mean, is there any issues around social distancing? Will that be more difficult to do? Or?
Yeah, it can be. But I think it depends how important it is to the client. So if there's a significant risk to the organisation, we're experienced enough to make that work. Now we're a lot of work from a distance. If we're going to get access to your systems from a distance, access to your controls from a distance, we're doing a piece of work, I won't say for who, where we're reviewing their cash collection processes because they had multiple sites with cash. How can they enhance that in the current circumstance? So all I'd say is try us or try organisations to see how they can help. We're conscious of the social distance. We're looking after our staff health as well. But if we can help, we will.
Brilliant. Okay. I'm conscious of time that we're coming up to the end of the session shortly. But just before we finish, Tim, I was going to say, I mean, are there any specific takeaways you'd like the audience to focus on from this particular session?
Yeah, so I suppose there's probably three messages. One is maintain your control environment. Don't change. Unless you really have to, don't change what's worked in the past. Number two is staff awareness. Make sure you are aware of the potentials, what they're doing. And the last one is actually to support staff. I think what we're very keen on is making sure we don't blame staff when we have support. So those staff who are working at home at a distance, make sure their IT kit is up to date, reduce that possibility for them to be victims of fraud.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm just checking to see if we've got any additional questions. I don't think we have. So as we said earlier in the session, we are recording this. So if there's any specific questions that you might have missed, obviously do have a look at our YouTube website, as this will be uploaded to our YouTube page later in the day. If you've got any specific questions that you'd like us to share with Tim, then feel free to email us. Tim, I think you mentioned as well that you'd be happy for us to share the slide deck as well.
So what I propose, we've got a couple of documents that we've developed in terms of the wider fraud risks that organisations just might want to consider, at least just to gain comfort themselves that they're doing these issues, they're covering these issues off. We'll send them through. Very happy for you to distribute those to the attendees on here, but anyone else you think fit.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, all that remains for me to say is, Tim, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Really informative, really helpful. Thank you to all the audience members as well. Thank you for your questions and your participation. As I mentioned earlier, we are holding a number of these webinars next week as well on a range of different topics. So please do have a look at our website for more details. Also, I'd like to make you aware of an event we've got next week, which is focusing on our quarterly business report, which is our main flagship economic publication, which is a health check on the regional economy. The theme of that event will be coronavirus and business resilience in Greater Birmingham. So really focusing on how firms are reacting to the current crisis. Our special guest speakers include Dr. Justin Varney, Director of Public Health at Birmingham City Council, and Nicholas Smith, partner at Squire Patton Boggs. We'll be talking about the steps that businesses are putting in place to alleviate risk around coronavirus. So if you are keen to attend, that's actually happening next week on Tuesday morning between 8 and 9. It's an online webinar, full details on our website, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Many thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.